his raincoat covering handcuffs, Hoffa arrives at federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He said his attorneys would continue his fight while he's in jail. Parole is possible in 32 months. At $100,000 annually, he's the nation's highest paid prisoner.
So Jimmy Hoffa gets sent to Lewisburg Federal Prison. Things get even more complicated for Hoffa there because he's housed with Genovese mob captain Tony Provenzano, who was also the president of a huge Teamster local in New Jersey at the time. And the two of them actually got into a fist fight with Hoffa yelling, "It's guys like you that got me in here in the first place." At the time all this is going on in prison, a national mob war is brewing out in the real world.
1964, 65, 66 was the Banana Wars. Joe Bonanno's son, Bill Bonanno, deciding to whack 3 of the heads of the 5 families. Joe Bonanno wound up in Tucson, Arizona. And in Tucson, Arizona, he made a pact with 2 Southern organized crime figures. One was Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss of New Orleans, and the other was Santo Trafficante of Tampa.
If the Bonanno, Marcello, Trafficante Southern powers could control Hoffa, they probably could control the single biggest prize in the country, the Teamster Pension Fund, which was really the goose that was laying golden egg after golden egg. Ultimately, the Mafia Commission patched up the rift between the mafia families, and Jimmy Hoffa was left on the outside looking in, but now with a new deadly enemy in the form of Anthony Tony Provenzano.
A murderer upstairs, or a man with 50 years alongside of you, and when you're trying to sleep under those conditions, unless you have a tremendous willpower, you're constantly with one eye open, looking to see whether or not you'll survive the night for the next day.
From the 1930s through the 1970s, most unions were giving their campaign money to Democrats. Hoffa gave his money to whomever would help the Teamsters and himself. And so sometimes he gave his money to Democrats, sometimes to Republicans. By the early 1970s, when he was in prison, Richard Nixon was president, and it became quite convenient for the Teamster to give money to Nixon and the Republicans, and in exchange, he received a pardon.
Well, I appreciate the fact that he signed the commutation papers. Whatever the effect will have on the members, I can't say. I haven't talked to any members.
Do you regard this as a strictly political move?
No, I do not. I think it was a regular routine commutation based upon my time served, based upon my sentence, and the background of the sentence.
Do you plan on supporting Nixon because he's doing this, or what?
It's too far away to make any prediction of what I will do politically.
And why would Nixon do that? And if Hoffa was this terrible organized labor figure / gangster, why is he entitled to a pardon? Those kind of things were all questions back then. It certainly undermined Nixon to a great degree. I mean, that was one of the many things that when people started to talk about Nixon as a president who didn't play by the rules, Nixon as a president who ultimately became the paranoid president. This was an example of that. This was Nixon the deal maker.
While Jimmy Hoffa was in prison from 67 to 71, America changed a lot. And when he got out, Hoffa's time had really passed in a lot of ways.
Hoffa, for one segment of the American population, epitomized organized labor, working for the blue collar, the common man, giving him his rights, giving him decent wages and working conditions. But for the people that were involved in the protests of the 1960s that wanted change, that were progressive, that were liberal, organized labor had become, in a lot of ways, part of the problem. I mean, the sons and daughters of blue-collar workers who had gone on to get an education kind of looked askance at all of that. They didn't appreciate what unions really were about. What they saw were unions corrupting the system. And I think Hoffa epitomized that to them. On the other hand, he epitomized the champion for the common man, for the earlier generation of workers.
Teamster Vice President Frank Fitzsimmons was running the Teamster show with Hoffa away in prison, and he was even more accommodating than Hoffa had been to organized crime.
But Fitzsimmons just allowed everyone to do their thing. That's the way he liked it, and that's the way the vice presidents liked it, and that's the way the mob liked it.
This union nor I am in the hands of organized crime. This union has nothing to hide on the general presidency of Frank Fitzsimmons.
Many of these guys had feathered their own personal nests pretty well during the Fitzsimmons tenure.
And the only thing that he was looking at that point was trying to get back into the leadership position with a union who didn't seem to want him around anymore.
He really only had one thing on his mind, which was claiming back the Teamsters presidency. This was his baby, his joy in life was being the president of the Teamsters.
Even though he had been involved with organized crime, he always figured it was a 50-50 relationship where he was getting things from them and returning for giving things to them, not only personally but for the labor movement. He thought that Frank Fitzsimmons had become a lackey for the members of organized crime, and he was very interested in getting back into the Teamsters Union. He was going to do whatever he could to get his power back, and if that involved agreeing to or deciding to take some of the mob influence out of the union, Hoffa was willing to do that to get the power back.
Hoffa's desperation reached a point where my sources in the federal government tell me that he actually became an FBI informant. This is a well-kept secret in the fact that it really hasn't been public record, but that Hoffa was actually a full-fledged informant by the end. There was an actual quid pro quo between Hoffa and his handlers in the federal government and the FBI that in exchange for Hoffa feeding them information about what he knew, the FBI, the federal government, was going to help lift the restriction on Hoffa's ability to run for the presidency of the Teamsters, and that he would be allowed to run in 1976. The word on the street was that Hoffa's restriction was most likely to be lifted was really a problem for the mob, in the sense that they realized that Hoffa had enough support and enough momentum behind him that he could easily win that 1976 election.
From Machiavelli, fortune favors the bold. He was going to make a bold move to try to come back. But I think there were just too many players involved, too many people who didn't want him to come back, and he couldn't control all the events and all the players, as he could have maybe 20 years earlier when he was at the peak of his power in the Teamsters Union.
So Hoffa's relationship with the Mafia is quickly deteriorating. His really only life raft at this point are the Giacalone brothers, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, the street bosses of the Detroit Mafia, the men that are really the faces of organized crime in Detroit. They do all the dirty work, they're the junkyard dogs, and they have long been Hoffa's contacts.
The Detroit family goes way back. I mean, it's one of the original families. It's part of the commission, part of the National Commission.
Through my years of undercover work, I don't believe that I was ever able to really penetrate the mob, the Detroit Mafia, if you will. These people had charisma. Some of them were very likable people. I think they were friendly, but from a distance, from afar. They were not the kind of people that would take a shining to strangers as part of their culture, their makeup. They don't deal with strangers.